Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the launch this afternoon of AIDR's new Flood Emergency Planning for Disaster Resilience Handbook. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my pleasure to host this webinar in partnership with Floodplain Management Australia, and I would like to acknowledge their President, Ian Dinham, who will provide some opening remarks shortly. The Flood Emergency Planning for Disaster Resilience Handbook is AIDR's latest published offering in the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. It is my pleasure to launch the new Flood Emergency Planning for Disaster Resilience Handbook today, and I'm delighted to announce that the new handbook is now live and freely available to download from the AIDR Knowledge Hub. You can see the link in the handbook on the slide here. It's quite timely that we published this handbook in November 2020 with the declaration of the La Nina anticipated the increased chances of flooding and cyclones for this spring and summer. We know that flooding poses a significant risk to Australian communities. In financial terms, we also know that the average annual economic losses for floods have been estimated as greater than cyclones, storms, bushfires and earthquakes, costing Australia $8.8 billion annually. It is essential that proactive flood emergency plans are developed to guide responses. Without plans, decision makers are forced to be reactive in their decision making and can be left to deal with avoidable consequences. The new Flood Emergency Planning for Disaster Handbook presents national principles and guidance to inform the development of flood emergency plans. It also outlines key considerations for specific capabilities and environments. The handbook is applicable to all communities across Australia and all levels of planning. Today, we have 4 guest speakers who will unpack the national principles and guidance presented in the new handbook. We also are joined by Duncan McCluckie, who I'm sure is well known to many on the webinar today, who will share his insights into how other handbooks in the collection are relevant to those working to address flood risk. And I would like to thank all the speakers who are leading experts in their fields across Australia for giving up their time today for today's webinar. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. Here in Melbourne, where I am based, that is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. Before we get to the overview of the Flood Emergency Planning for Disaster Resilience Handbook, I would like to just take a few moments to give you an overview of the handbook's program. The handbook collection presents national principles and guidance to build national capability to support a disaster resilient Australia. A suite of companion documents also support the implementation of the high-level principles and guidance presented in the handbooks. We support the handbooks with companion documents including checklists, practitioners' guidelines, case studies, and our newly developed knowledge into action briefs. The whole point of these companion documents are to assist people from all levels of government and the community sector to implement the principles from the handbooks at a local level. The handbooks are developed and reviewed by national consultative committees comprised of subject matter experts from a range of state and territory agencies, governments, organisations and individuals involved in disaster resilience. The collection is sponsored by the Australian Government Department of Home Affairs. Since AIDR was established in 2015, 16 handbooks have been developed across a range of disaster resilience themes, including the following titles published in 2020: Land Use Planning for Disaster Resilient Communities, Emergency Planning, and Community Engagement for Disaster Resilience. Other titles include Managing the Floodplain, Public Information and Warnings, and Australian Emergency Management Arrangements. All of these are available and accessible on the AIDR Knowledge Hub. You can download them freely or you can place an order for a hard copy. As part of this year's program of work, we are developing Australia's inaugural Disaster Risk Handbook, and that is currently in the scoping stage. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today you will see our presenters as well as their slides on the screen. You will be muted for the duration of the webinar. A significant component of today's webinar is dedicated to Q&A. We ask that you please use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and we will address these following our speakers' presentations. Please feel free to use the chat function for general comments, and please make sure you select all panelists and attendees in the chat window so that everyone can view your messages during the webinar. We've had more than 450 people register for today's session, so we do ask for your patience if there are any issues, and please note that we will be recording this webinar and uploading it to the Knowledge Hub for you to view again later or share with your colleagues. Today, our speakers, as I said, we have 5 speakers presenting, and we're very fortunate to have such a group of experts to present today's handbooks. Andrew Gissing, the handbook writer and General Manager, Resilience at Risk Frontiers. Mike Lolback, Group Manager, Member and Advisory Services with Local Government Association Queensland. Angela Toniato, the Senior Natural Resource Officer, Floodplain Management with New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And Tamsin Achilles, Manager, Emergency Management Planning with Vic SES. And Duncan McLuckie, Principal Flood Specialist with New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. We are very grateful to have them presenting today, and I would also like to acknowledge the significant role they played in the development of the handbook. I'd now like to introduce Ian Dinham, President of Floodplain Management Australia, to share some introductory remarks. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Thanks very much.
I can't see you though, Ian.
Thank you.
Can't see.
Can't see me?
No.
So what do I click on there? Melissa might help.
We can see you now, Ian. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks very much, Amanda, and thank you for that overview. My name's Ian Dinham. I'm National President of Floodplain Management Australia. It's a large organisation consisting of members such as the state and federal government agencies, local councils, corporate industry, practicing professionals, international members, and so on. So on behalf of all them today, I want to thank you and thank AIDR for this event. Thanks very much to Caitlin and Melissa for helping, and for Duncan suggesting that we get together, and everyone who's logged in. These national best practice handbooks are a great step forward in resourcing where we go from here. The flood emergency planning for natural disaster resilience is a way of reversing the trend where in Australia our expenditure on recovery and rebuilding and cleaning up way exceeds the investment in preventative measures. And this research and this information actually helps to start reversing that trend so that we can plan better and do better in the future. So very briefly, I wish to commend AIDR and this work, and also emphasise that FMA shares the same ideals as AIDR. We know that flooding, according to Deloitte's, costs something like $8.8 billion per year. So we do need to start planning for the future to try and turn that around. So I look forward today to all of our speakers and the information that's going to be presented, and FMA looks forward to further collaboration in the future with AIDR. So thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Ian. We're now going to move to a poll. Before we get started, I'd just like you all just to take a few moments to answer the poll. This will help speakers when we get down to the Q&A session to understand who's on the line and who, you know, what sort of experience you have with regard to flood emergency planning. So there are 4 questions for you to answer. I'm fairly new, keen to learn more. I have some experience and knowledge. I have quite a lot of experience and knowledge, and I'm mainly here because it sounded relevant and interesting. So I'll give you just a few moments, if I could, to fill in the poll, and those results will come up on screen shortly for you all. Okay, just a couple more moments. Someone's saying the poll has disappeared from their screen. I'm not sure whether that's the case with everyone. Just 1 or 2 more moments and then we'll close down the poll. Okay, people are telling us they can't see the poll. Oh, well, there we are. We have our results. So about 22% of you are fairly new. About half of the people have some experience and knowledge. About another 20% have quite a lot of experience and knowledge. And about 10% of you are here because it sounded relevant and interesting. Unfortunately, there must have been some technical issues in the background because not all of you could see the poll. And I'm not sure why I'm not on screen either. I would normally be on screen, but I don't seem to be able to see myself. There we are. Okay, so without any further ado, we will go to our first speaker, Andrew Gissing. Andrew is the General Manager, Resilience with Risk Frontiers. He is a nationally recognised risk and resilience leader. He works with government, business and not-for-profits to make our communities safer. Andrew was also the writer of this handbook. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Amanda, and hello everybody online here this afternoon. Really great to see a large number of people interested in the topic of flood emergency planning, and obviously very topical, as other speakers have said. I too want to acknowledge traditional elders on the land of which I am on today. I also want to acknowledge those folks that were on the committee that governed, and also were on the steering committee for this handbook. It was very good to have their valuable feedback along the way and to bounce various bits and pieces along with them. So very much appreciated. So this handbook really, in terms of its background, used to be the compendium of really 4 different handbooks before, which were known as the various flood manuals. There was the dam safety planning manual there was the flood response, there was the flood planning, and then there was the total flood warning systems manual. So what we've done here in this new manual is try to really bring those 4 together. There was a lot of duplication between the 4 manuals. They were basically written as standalone documents on their own. So what we've really tried to do with this document that we're launching today is bring those key principles together. And I'll go through the principles just in a moment, just in one handbook, which is relatively more concise and more principles based than previously. They will be, this handbook will be supported though by 2 companion documents, one being the application of the total warning system to floods, which will bring again the approach to the total flood warning system, but in the context of the existing handbook now, which has been written on the total warning system approach. So there's that, and also a companion document on flood community engagement there as well. So those 2 companion documents are to come out later, but not too far away. I just want to start the presentation today by just reflecting on a quote here. So the UK Environment Agency recently had a review of all flood emergency planning in the UK, and they engaged Major General Tim Cross to undertake that. And this was one of the quotes from the report that I think really sum up the value of flood emergency planning and why we're all online today. So I'll just read that out for everybody. A well thought out, thought through and clear plan provides the foundation of an effective response and reduces the potential impact of the flood substantially. Many of the effects are also predictable, and if the risks are properly understood in advance, responders can be clear what the likely impacts will look like over time and location, thus ensuring that they can act decisively to protect people and communities. I think that really well captures the purpose of undertaking flood emergency planning. So I'll just move to the next slide here. Great. So let's just go through the various principles that have been developed as part of the manual to really bring about this principles-based approach. So the first one here, plans are risk-based. Obviously, that's a generic principle across all emergency planning, but in the context of flooding, plans are risk-based and informed by studies of flood behaviour, previous flood history and knowledge of community exposure and vulnerabilities. Plans should consider possible compounding and cascading impacts in addition to the flood hazard. Plans should be based on current day risk, but be regularly updated to reflect the changing nature of risk, not only from climate change, but also obviously changing demographics, changing land use, etc. The next principle here is that plans are holistic. So plans need to consider the full range and causes of flooding, so e.g. heavy rainfall, dam failure, storm surge and tsunami, and also the full range of flood events, including worst case scenarios, and provide for coordination across the framework of PPRR. The third principle here is that plans are scalable, flexible and adaptable to all forms of flooding and differing natures of flooding also. The fourth principle, plans are based on realistic assumptions concerning social behaviour. So we understand in this principle about how communities may respond to flooding, and we take that knowledge into account when we're actually developing our plans, that we actually consider what the community will be doing as a consequence of flooding and flood warnings. So just the next slide there, please. Plans are also consistent with relevant legislation, regulations and governance arrangements there. So this also includes consideration of cross-jurisdictional considerations and arrangements. The sixth principle is plans are linked to required capability and capacity. So in other words, that they are linked to required resources. To achieve desired outcomes and priorities, planning identifies the demands different flood scenarios may have on resourcing and informs capacity development strategies. So we're not only seeing flood plans being linked to strategies that might actually be called upon in terms of preparedness response, but also informing those capacity and capability development activities. Seventhly, we've got plans that are concise, principles-based, simple to interpret and define priorities and desired outcomes. So in this sense, flood plans are not meant to be a huge Bible, which might potentially restrict the actions and be very prescriptive. They are to be read from an operational perspective, which links into our next principle, which are plans are contemporary, provide an authorising environment for decision makers, and written from an operational perspective. The ninth principle, just on the next slide here, is that planning is most effective when it's integrated rather than fragmented. So this means that planning involves interagency planning and designing plans to ensure responses are integrated across agencies and with those of volunteers and community groups as well. So integrated both horizontally and vertically across a much wider planning framework. Planning is obviously proactive, getting to the 10th principle here, and enables better decisions to enact forward-leaning responses based on warning systems, flood intelligence, and pre-considered arrangements and strategies. Number 11, planning is a shared responsibility. Communities are involved throughout the planning process and have significant buy-in. Plans are written to enable a whole of community response, as well as emergency services and broader government responses as well. Just there at the 12th, planning is adequately resourced. So it's recognised that planning is central to the culture of flood emergency management organisations and embedded into all aspects of organisational structures, policies and practices. Just the next slide there. And then finally, last two principles. Plans are regularly exercised and stakeholders are aware of their contents. So plans are plans are part of processes that educates, trains and exercise an organisation, so they are well understood and embedded into the process of what to do into its culture and its core business. And then lastly, plans are living documents and planning is an ongoing process. They are maintained and regularly updated to ensure they remain relevant in the context of the community risk profile. So just on the last slide there that I have. So the other key thing that is neat in the new handbook and is advanced on the previous manual is some up-to-date case studies. Really show how these principles come to life, how we in Australia have really taken these principles and using them already in the way that flood emergency planning, flood warning, flood intelligence are already being implemented. So there's some really good case studies that people can use to lean on in terms of the design of their own systems and planning there as well. So thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Amanda now.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Mike Lolback. Mike is the Group Manager of Member and Advisory Services with the Local Government Association of Queensland and the organisational lead on disaster and emergency management. Mike's career includes roles with Sunshine Coast and Redland City Councils in Queensland. He served as New South Wales Police Detective for 20 years and he's been a functional disaster management officer working on large-scale disaster events and representing the sector at a state, national and international level. He also lectured at AMI and Queensland Regional College of Disaster Management. Mike is currently a doctoral candidate exploring contemporary measures of community resilience and improved disaster management practices with focuses on the recommendations of the 2011 Queensland Flood Commission of Inquiry. Thanks very much, Mike.
Thanks, Amanda. And as per standard, I take it people can see me and hear me. Could I also start by acknowledging the First Nation people of all the lands that we're meeting on today, and particularly pay my respects to the Turrbal, the Jagera and the Yugambal people who are the traditional owners of the Greater Brisbane region. And I'd like to thank AIDR and FMA for the invitation to be here today and acknowledge my fellow presenters. I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the working group for the many valuable and vibrant discussions we've had in the completion of this contemporary version of the flood planning handbook. I'm not a flood engineer. I've been a disaster manager, lecturer and practitioner for close to 40 years though. And whilst I don't pretend to understand the intricacies of hydrology and floodplain management, I know where to find the people that do. And this manual is about just that. It advocates for a collaborative and broad partnership across multiple disciplines and with the community in undertaking planning. In consideration of my discussion today, I've chosen to share with you some of the research I'm currently undertaking with Charles Sturt University under the supervision of Associate Professors Valerie Ingham and Ruth Delaforce. On the 4th of December 2019, in the Australian Emergency Management Journal, Steve Sutton and his companions ask questions. Are we ready for the future? And they speculate when it comes to disaster management, it depends on who you ask. But they go one step further and they suggest that it's unthinkable for an agency or government not to take measures to protect citizens by properly planning. One trend that appears to accommodate failure of mitigation is to label an event unprecedented. And such was the case with the flooding across Queensland in late 2010 and early 2011. Over 78% of the state was affected by flooding, with more than 200,000 people directly affected and close to 6,000 evacuations from 3,600 homes. The flooding was the result of multiple events culminating in the aftermath of tropical cyclone Tasha that crossed the coast in northern Queensland on Christmas Day in 2010. And whilst the number of people who have lost their lives has fluctuated, it is generally accepted that tragically 37 people died due to the event, 3 whose bodies have never been recovered. And it's with respect to those people and the families that they left behind that I'll focus my discussion today, particularly on the flooding of the Brisbane, along the Brisbane River in January 2011. Could I have the next slide, please? In 2017, reviewing the response to Tropical Cyclone Debbie and its impact on Queensland, The then Inspector General for Emergency Management, Ian Mackenzie, introduced with the following words: whilst local lessons are often identified by individual disaster groups and agencies, lessons for the broader sector are less so. Even more challenging for the sector is turning lessons identified during post-operations into future improvement. Now, these words, in my opinion, go to the central premise of the Flood Planning Handbook and reflect many of the failures that continue to present themselves internationally in planning, response, recovery, and the broader disaster management. Next slide, please. And for those amongst us that like looking at maps, this map is a snapshot of the Brisbane flooding on January 13th, 2011. It'll become a little more relevant as my presentation goes along. The two areas I'd like you to look at particularly are the top right of the map, which shows the Brisbane city, and towards the centre of the map, you'll see Ipswich and major areas of flooding. The reason I chose to put this map up is because those blue areas don't simply indicate flooding, they indicate the homes, the schools, and the businesses of the people that we are charged to protect. The response to the flooding now resonates in Australian history. Thousands of people came to Brisbane to assist in what's now known as the Mud Army. They volunteered their time, their equipment, and expertise in helping the thousands that had been so badly affected. Next slide, please. And as often happens in the aftermath of disaster, a commission of inquiry was established to, amongst other things, seek to reduce the likelihood of future flooding. In both the interim and final reports, designed to be read as two distinct chapters, 352 separate recommendations followed, many with direct impact on land use, flood and dam management, and the vast majority can be easily identified as completed or underway. In her opening remarks, the Honourable Justice Catherine Holmes, then Commissioner of the Inquiry and now Queensland's Chief Justice, stated, "Years of drought did not promote rigour in flood planning, whether in disaster response, dam management or land use. There is a risk that the recommendations made here will be taken up enthusiastically in the short term, but absent another flood event in the next few years, priorities will drift and lessons will be forgotten." And that is the basis of the research that I'm doing at the present time. Could I have the next slide, please? 29 of those 352 recommendations are not immediately obvious in either their uptake or the completion. Each of these recommendations fit within three specific categories, not technical or engineering based, and they are resilience, including organisational, community and infrastructure, social impacts, directly linked community capacity and understanding and communications, and disaster risk and planning, particularly in the area of the identification and the treatment of risks. In 2013, former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Mick Kelty, in undertaking a review of the Queensland emergency services and their capacity to respond to disasters, found that despite numerous disaster reviews over many years, recommendations had either never been realised or were painfully slow in their uptake. Next slide, please. Of interest, I thought I would share with you a few of my findings. Each of these photos that you see here were taken on Charlotte Street in the central business district of Queensland, of Brisbane rather. The first slide on the top left shows Charlotte Street during the 1893 floods of Brisbane. The second one in the 1974 floods of Brisbane, and the one at the bottom shows the floods on the 13th of January 2011. Now, whilst you may speculate that it would appear that 1893 had the largest flood, I'm anecdotally told that Brisbane is actually about 1 to 2 metres higher in terms of its street cape than it was back there. So what we're looking at are three very similar floods. Next slide, please. This next slide shows the Ipswich Business District, again in 1893, in 1974, and in 2011. And you'll see by the road at the rear of the photographs that they're taken from almost identical locations. You can see from these three slides that the flooding has not changed dramatically over over a century. Next slide, please. The two maps that I've got on the screen here show the flooding in Brisbane in 1893 on the left-hand side and the flooding at its peak in 2011. If you look at the upper right-hand side of the maps and start to trace down, you will see some incredibly similar shapes as to where the flooding moved. Again, you can see that separated by almost a century, the flooding that occurred in 2011 is almost identical to the flooding that occurred in 1893. Most importantly, this flooding has not changed dramatically in terms of the areas of inundation, despite the building of the Wivenhoe Dam that was completed in the early 80s and built in direct response to the Queensland floods, to the Brisbane floods. Whilst the dam is a major water source, when it was built, then Premier Joh Bjelke-Petersen indicated that the dam was being built to, and I quote, assure Brisbane would never flood again. Next slide, please. Which leads me directly to why we have completed the contemporary version of the Planning Handbook, and why those involved in its evolution are so passionate about its worth and use across the entire section. It draws on the expertise and experiences and is reviewed across emerging and national issues. It has included inputs from flood management experts and disaster management specialists where specific, and shows hands-on experience and understanding of how things should be done. It's designed to be used to assist planners across the nation in putting together contemporary and relevant flood planning processes. Next slides, please. Now, in the opening remarks, Andrew spoke about the 14 principles, and whilst I've got them here, I want to talk about them slightly differently. They are not designed to be ticked off by like a laundry list, and that's something that we were very clear about when we put our we were putting this together. We want them to be a thought-provoking way that planners can look across the principles and determine what the needs are. You'll see that some of the things talk about realistic and achievable, easy to read, etc., is what we were getting at with this entire process. It advocates for plans that can be easily accessible. Can we go to the next slide, please? And on the basis of that, what we're looking at is a readable, easily to digest plan that involves the many agencies and the many levels of expertise that we have up there. Sometimes in putting planning together, it's important to look to the past, look to the future, determine what the needs are, and put together something that is going to be easily digestible by the community. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to talk today. Just in closing, a little bit like Andrew did earlier, in looking through the process, I found a quote by Inglesby in 2011 that spoke about the progress of disaster planning and preparedness, where he said the disaster response community needs to find more effective ways to prepare for catastrophic events because large numbers of lives could be saved through advanced planning. And to me, that sums up exactly why we all came together to put this manual together and why it is of such importance for you to look at in ensuring that you can put together relevant and contemporary plans for your communities. And I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity of presenting to you today.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'd now like to introduce to you our third speaker, Angela Toniato. Angela has extensive experience in flood risk management through roles she has held within local and state governments. She has developed and provided strategic advice on flood emergency management matters, including emergency planning, operational planning, and land use planning. Angela is currently the Senior Natural Resource Officer, Floodplain Management with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, where she is working on the development of strategic guidance to support implementation of New South Wales flood-prone land policy. Thank you very much.
Hi all, and thanks so much for that introduction, Amanda. So I too would like to acknowledge the Darawal people on which land that I am providing this meeting today. So I'm going to base my discussion today on some of those key principles that really resonate with me on the handbook, and they just happen to be the first 3 in this particular handbook that Andrew has already spoken to today, and really focus on information that's used to understand the risk and develop that into intelligence in a particular location, and with a bit of a flood risk management bent, I suppose, and let you know where we're up to, also to assist emergency planning in New South Wales. Next slide, please. So whilst, you know, all the principles are absolutely important, time's really limiting me to really focus on a few here. So these are the ones that I think have that direct linkage with flood risk management and information from the flood risk management process for the discussion today. So these are the 3 principles, and I won't read them out. Andrew has done that already today. And they have this direct correlation to information, including information from the flood risk management process, which many of you are familiar with, and is really similar in New South Wales to that outlined in the National Best Practice Managing the Floodplain Handbook 7, available from AIDR. Next slide, please. So a bit about our agency and how we work together with the SES. So we're the lead flood risk management agency in New South Wales, and we work really closely with councils to assist their development of flood risk management plans. So we do that through the policy and the state's floodplain management program primarily, but we also work outside of that and work very closely with other agencies as well. So SES are a really integral part of that flood risk management process in New South Wales, and they're involved in flood risk management committees, and they have that multidisciplinary membership in the community, in the representation of that committee, including the community. So they're all involved in that process to develop the plans and recommendations for actions and works. And also there may be recommendations for things like updates to flood plans or flood emergency planning as well. So emergency managers can really contribute to this process. They can contribute their understanding of, you know, historical flooding and intelligence that they may hold, and that can inform a lot of the technical aspects of the process. So it might be the calibration or validation components of developing models even, and they can also provide advice on emergency management difficulties like those that may have been experienced in past events as well. So it really informs the study and plan and the recommendations out of the process. So in return in this process, SES get a lot of information. So they get information on the full range of flooding from the process. They then have to use that to analyse that, verify, understand the uncertainties and assumptions within that, and then really value add to that to develop an understanding of risk as intelligence and then plan. So the information from our perspective really isn't directly intelligence. There are a few steps in between. Next slide, please. So the information produced in studies is often very complex and can be quite difficult to interpret. So whilst we think, you know, a GIS layer might tell a whole story, you know, what we really need to be asking from a flood study outputs is, you know, what aren't these maps actually telling us? Like, do we just have one model run here on this map, or, you know, what makes up this map? So often there's layers of different runs overlaid to get envelopes of extents that will come out of a study. So that might be with or without, you know, tailwater conditions, a whole range of different assumptions, or in this case, say an ocean boundary, for example. So emergency plans need to consider that full range of flooding, and that's nothing new. It's also the characteristics and that variability in the potential flooding, and to really inform the intelligence in a meaningful way. So it's not just the extent that matters, you know, there's a whole range of other issues. There's, you know, what the depths are, what the hazard is, how that relates to risk, what's the rate of rise of a particular flood, or the duration of that flood to inform, you know, and also inform timing for community response or the warning associated with that. So what are some of the potential tipping points, for example, where the impacts on the community might change from one event to another, say from a community being isolated to then becoming inundated? So these are some of the questions that I think emergency planners really need to have answered. And I think flood risk managers are often, sometimes underutilised in that work. So I think that they can really help to navigate through that information, to also help scope a lot of and get the right information out of that process. They can also then use that information and identify the uncertainties and the likely variables for a particular location to assist in emergency planners' understanding of the impacts and develop that intelligence. So then considering the other information that really needs to be input to emergency planning as well, you know, there's even more information, this copious amount of information and associated assumptions and uncertainty with that information that that has to be worked out, you know, and it can't be worked out in the lead up to an event or during an event to inform that response. You know, that then becomes quite reactive, and it may lead to misinterpretation of the information. So we really need to be proactive. So I think we all really need to work together, have that collaboration, and work together with other agencies, whether it be the Bureau, ourselves, you know, dam owners and operators, you know, the list goes on. There's a whole range of collaborators in this space. Next slide, please. There it is. Okay, so what are we doing in New South Wales at the moment? So we've recognised that this information and the importance of the partnerships between councils, emergency managers, other areas of government, and the community, other stakeholders for decades. And I think the importance of the information also being fit for purpose is really critical, and that really contributes to the emergency management planning. So it's no different in the work that we're currently doing for the update of the Floodplain Development Manual at the moment. So as part of that role in government, we've had 2 key guides which inform the outputs from the flood risk management process, and they've been around since about the mid-2000s to assist getting the information to assist emergency planning. So we're now updating and developing new guidance to support that really important work, and those 4 guides are listed on that slide. So we've developed this really closely with the SES, and that means that, you know, I think we can have that mutual understanding of the importance of the information that comes out of the process, as well as the partnership and the commitment that we've got in getting the information and outcomes from these processes. So we're hoping that this will get us to a place where the information's, you know, more easily used to inform emergency planning, and ultimately to provide more confidence in using that information and informing decision making, so we can get those outcomes for New South Wales communities. Next slide, please. So to me, I think the real power of the emergency planning and what emergency managers can do with the plan is it can be used to influence decisions and decision making. So those with responsibilities that can make decisions that might impact emergency management in some negative or positive ways, you can use this to inform a whole range of decisions to get some better outcomes. So it might be in developing recommendations or priorities in your work, say in developing or implementing a flood risk management plan, and it may be as simple as you know, working together with emergency managers to prioritise works and measures that may assist emergency response where that is absolutely critical. So it could be improvements to a flood warning system or a new system to enable more time and warning for that particular community, or it may be some particular works that might give you more time to prepare for community response as well. So it's also the community engagement activities. We can also prioritise those and perhaps target some areas with some higher emergency management difficulties where they're known, and work together to do that engagement on that united front with councils and with emergency managers. So understanding how an emergency management strategy or difficulties can also inform land use planning decision making. So they can influence things like, it might be development controls to try and minimise some risks in some ways through redevelopment of that particular community, or perhaps in strategic planning, so locating development, considering the emergency management difficulties in a location, and maybe try and put that in a better location if there are significant difficulties, for example. So to me, the emergency planning component is actually really powerful, and emergency managers can influence decision making, and that's typically through participating in different processes, getting involved in different processes, but it really is also up to decision makers to have access to the information and to use that in an appropriate way, and that has to be done in consultation with emergency managers. So there really is that influence there. Next slide, please. So a bit of a take home from me, flood emergency planning, the information and decisions that inform it, or those that can be made from it, I think they all stem from a flood risk management partnership and collaboration. So it's the collaboration and the relationships that you form and the work that you do when it's dry that really help you plan and prepare for flooding. So, and to ultimately really make those decisions and good decisions in operations. So trying to use and understand that information, you know, during an event or in the immediate lead up to an event, with overwhelming copious amounts of information and intelligence, you know, whether it be from warnings, you know, general gauge information to impacts, which can be used to potentially inform, say, the evacuation of the community, which is pretty critical. You know, this can't be done without a clear understanding of that information and how those inputs really inform that strategy. So it can't be done effectively on the run. We might have multiple systems in flood. And that's what happens in reality. We don't just have one particular catchment in isolation. So the priorities in those situations need to really be clear. And that can only happen with, you know, that adaptable, scalable planning, whether it happen on a catchment basis, and then also then coming up to a regional basis and understanding what's happening in that context as well. Then I think once you actually do that, and even if you don't even use the plan exactly how it's written, I think you've gone through that process and the what ifs that are involved in that process and the uncertainties, and knowing how to interpret the information. So then you can really use that plan to make some good decisions, I think, on the day. So that's my take pretty much on the key things to consider when looking at those first 3 principles of the handbook. And I think there's some that are wiser than me that might back me up on some of that. The next slide, please. And thanks all for your time today. So I'll leave you with a bit of a quote from Stephen Colbert on the value of a plan B. Thanks so much again.
Thank you very much, Angela. It was really insightful, and it's good to be able to interpret what's at that high level principle into some action. So I really appreciate your comments there. Now it's your turn. You thought you were just joining a webinar and could listen to this in the background while you did other work, but we have another plan for you. So what we would like you to do is to participate today with us in what we call a chat bomb. We have nearly 300 of you online today. So hopefully this will generate a bit of a sense of we're all struggling with some of these issues together. We get a bit of connectedness, even though we're in an online world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a question to you, and you will need to use the chat function to answer it. But what we want you to do is put your answer into the chat function, but not press enter. And we're all going to do that together when I count you down. So the question that I am posing for you is, what is the first question that comes to mind when you think about the challenges and opportunities for flood emergency planning for disaster resilience? I'll give you around 30 seconds to answer the question. I'll repeat it for you. So what we want you to do is put your response into the chat, but not press enter. So hopefully you're listening along with this. So the question is, what is the first question that comes to mind when you think about the challenges and opportunities for flood emergency planning for disaster resilience? So the first thing that comes to mind when you start to think about your role within this, how challenging this is. We've put the chat bomb question in the chat for those of you that were struggling to listen along. So please put your answer into the chat function. Don't press enter. Give you a couple more minutes or a couple more seconds. Okay, you'll be able to read everyone else's answer as well. So you might find that there are many online that have the same challenges that you have. If you have your chat open, you'll be able to see all the comments flooding into the screen. Okay, so hopefully you've had long enough by now to think about what your answer is to that question, the first question that comes to mind. I'm going to count you down, and I want you to all press enter. So in 3, 2, 1, press enter. Okay. If you've got your chat open, you can see all the myriad questions coming in: competing resources, learning lessons from the past, political issues, competing responsibilities, getting buy-in from people, coordination, keep them coming, how to promote effective community engagement. Okay, so lots of comments. You can read them all for yourself, and when we get to the Q&A session, we can answer some of these. We're also going to try and do a first today where we're going to create a bit of a word cloud with your responses. So we'll see how that goes. So please keep those responses coming to our question. In the interest of time, I'll now move on to our fourth speaker, Tamsin Achilles. So Tamsin is the Manager, Emergency Management Planning of Victoria State Emergency Service. Tamsin has had 10 years of experience working in disaster mitigation and emergency management, both at the Bureau of Meteorology and Vic SES. During this time, she has contributed to a handful of AIDR handbooks and co-authored Sending a Message: How Significant Events Have Influenced the Warnings Landscape in Australia. With a background in social sciences, compliance, planning and risk communication, Tamsin delivers a systems thinking approach to emergency management planning that focuses on the importance of partnerships and collaboration to deliver high quality outcomes for the community and sector. Please welcome Tamsin. Thank you, Tamsin.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and appreciate the introduction, and it's fabulous to be with you all today. I'm meeting with you on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional custodians of this continent, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be participating in the webinar today. At SES, I have the pleasure of managing the fabulous emergency management planning team who work across areas of risk, intelligence, warnings, legislation and planning, all of which are critical elements that are highlighted in this handbook. Having worked in each of these areas, I've been drawn to the emergency management planning area, as well as the contributing to the development of this handbook due to the opportunity that has been provided to contribute to such an important resource for the sector. And it also provides, as you've heard today, a overarching framework for the cohesive, to bring together the cohesively contributing areas and activities to contribute to effective management of flood events. Next slide, please. So I would firstly like to take a step back before moving forward. I'm sure we can all recall an important learning or insight when we were first introduced to flood emergency planning. For some of you, that introduction may be today. For me, I was struck by the apparent complexity of the arrangements for flood mitigation, response, relief and recovery, along with the sheer number of stakeholders involved. Though after some time, the pieces of the puzzle slid together to form a complete picture. The importance of partnerships and collaboration was a clear takeaway message for me and has never left me since as a key priority in all of my activities. It therefore comes as no surprise that collaboration and communication are a critical element of flood emergency planning throughout the emergency planning process, as you have already seen today. With this reflection in mind, I have a challenge for each of you today: to consider flood emergency planning from a new perspective, to see what insights you might gain. For those of you that are skeptical about the challenge, or who may have been working in this space for many years, when was the last time you considered flood emergency planning from the perspective of one of your key stakeholders? What are their needs and role in flood emergency planning? And how does this interrelate or maybe impacted or influenced by your role? And if you're struggling to recall what stakeholders are involved in the process, or perhaps this is new to you, you can pick from a list of key audiences within the handbook on page 3. Next slide, please. So flood emergency planning in Victoria. We've heavily drawn on the emergency management manual series, of which the handbook supersedes. Our planning illustrates many of the key elements of the handbooks that you've already heard from Andrew, such as the use of the emergency management planning process, being guided by the emergency planning principles. We've shaped them to be risk-based and considerate of specific capabilities and planning for special environments. At SES, we have developed flood emergency plans for state, regional and municipal tiers of emergency management planning, which delivers a comprehensive and scalable framework of flood planning that may be activated based on the requirements of each event. This work has been completed with the involvement of our key stakeholders across the state for each tier of planning. And our regional personnel have taken a heavy workload in this because our objective has been that those leading the work are understanding and of the local issues for the geographic area or complexities, that they encompass and recognise local knowledge and also respect the local relationships that are held. The framework of flood emergency plans in Victoria also proactively meets the requirements of new emergency management legislation that comes into effect on the 1st of December this year, that's articulated in the Emergency Management Legislation Amendment Act 2018 for those in Victoria. For those of you that might be interested in viewing our plans, please take a look at the SES website. You'll see a link on the slide now. But I also want to recognise that you can anticipate further updates over the coming years as we continue to translate the learnings into improvements for our flood plans, as Mike has already mentioned. And this will of course be influenced by the content outlined in this handbook. Next slide, please. Now you have a broad context of flood emergency planning in Victoria. With the remainder of the time, I want to briefly highlight a few key elements of the handbook, including 2 key case studies identified in Chapter 4, Understanding Flood Emergency Risk, and 2 steps of the flood emergency planning process, being documenting the plan as well as implementation review. You've heard some learnings from post-event reviews from Mike, along with the process and practices from Angela. So I would now like to take the opportunity to highlight components of the handbook by sharing those initiatives that I've mentioned that are changing the way that we do business in Victoria, along with the components of the planning process that have been impacted and certainly that we have relied on heavily throughout the year due to spring and summer flood preparedness across the state, as well as to acknowledge COVID-19 and COVID safe work practices as well. Next slide, please. So in Chapter 4 of the handbook, Understanding Flood Emergency Management Risk, it highlights that flood risk is generated by the potential for flooding to interact with the community and or physical environment. It additionally highlights the importance of benefits of establishing pathways and networks for local knowledge to be captured and considered in decision making before, during and after flooding. VicSES has understood the importance of the community's role, consequently having developed and implemented the SES Local Knowledge Policy many years ago. The Local Knowledge Policy provides an overview of the purpose for gathering local knowledge, how it contributes to activities such as emergency management planning, and outlines specific strategies to gather the information. The intelligence, I should say, of course, as Angela has just outlined the difference there. The implementation of this policy has been significantly advanced with recent and ongoing project that is detailed in the local knowledge case study of the handbook, which uses new technology in the form of an app called SnapSendSolve. This app enables information to be quickly and easily communicated from community observers to emergency management personnel to support decision making. Further details may be found on page 20 of the handbook. Next slide, please. In regard to the visualisation of risk-based information, the handbook states that flood information and flood emergency management risk analysis should be summarised in flood emergency plans in a manner that is easily digested by incident management teams. In Victoria, we can take this one step further by utilising a web-based platform, flood intelligence platform called FloodZoom. FloodZoom contains detailed information from flood studies such as flood extents, depths and flood levels, which can be used to inform decisions before, during and after flooding. It also brings together real-time and historic rain and stream flow records, flood forecasts and property data. Further information can be found on page 21 of the handbook. Next slide, please. The handbook also details that plans should be documented so that they are clear to their audience. Considering the needs of the audience and ensuring clarity and accessibility of our plans has been a key objective during the development of the state, regional and municipal flood plans. And we have relied on the highly valued feedback of our stakeholders to guide this. More recently, and driven by spring and summer flooding preparedness, we have made further enhancements to our flood emergency plans to ensure accessibility of information for our audience. This has included simplification of our state flood plan to ensure removal of any duplicate information, development and inclusion of COVID-19 principles and highlighting key resources in the sector that detail COVID safe work practices for the sector, as well as the development of companion resources, which will be integrated into our regional flood emergency plans, known as our regional flood narratives, which provide tailored risk information about major flood hotspots across each region and the potential consequences, key considerations, and known changes since the last major flooding. These activities also illustrate the application of Principle 14, which is detailed on page 6 of the handbook, that plans are a living document and planning is an ongoing process. Next slide, please. Finally, this brings me to the implementation and review, which is, of course, the critical final step in the flood emergency planning process before the cycle begins again. Given the recent updates made to our flood emergency plans and to ensure that our plans are fit for purpose and up to date, as recommended in the handbook, SES has undertaken a range of activities to support the implementation and review of our plans, including delivering spring and summer preparedness briefings, which have a strong focus on flood emergency plans, running regional flood exercises, which includes the activation of respective flood emergency plans, and providing tailored communications to key stakeholders about the protocols and practices in place to ensure COVID-safe work practices as they relate to flooding. So what I've outlined today really detail our spring and summer preparedness activities, which of course is a great example of the significant advancement to our resources and practices that can occur in the lead up to, or what many recognise may occur post significant flooding. Though we are also very conscious of the need for the reviews and exercising to occur on a regular basis as outlined in the handbook. As such, our activities are based on a 3-year planning cycle that is articulated in our internal emergency management planning policy, and work is currently being planned to ensure coordination of flood emergency planning activities and updates of our plans, and coordinating these with our state exercising calendar as well to deliver an end-to-end process. Next slide, please. I'd like to finish by sharing our values at SES, of which focus and adaptable has been applied to its full potential across this year, and the organisation through the activities that I've shared with you today. I would also like to thank Mike Edwards, Program Leader, Strategic Advisor at the Department of Environment, Land, Water Planning, who is one of the co-authors of the handbook, who I've had the privilege of collaborating with throughout the course of the development of this handbook. It has been a pleasure to contribute to the handbook and reflect on the great work that has occurred across our teams, organisations, as well as the broader sector in Victoria. But of course, as Mike has said as well, that this has been a significant collaboration effort nationally, and I'd like to also acknowledge the significant contribution of all involved in the development of the handbook, including the AIDR team, who have progressed this work in a very complex and challenging year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tamsin, and really great to see the good work that SES is doing in this area. I'd just like to remind you that we will have a Q&A session following our last speaker. We already have 12 questions in the Q&A, which is great, but keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. You can also upvote questions that you like, and they'll move higher up the list for me to pose to our expert panelist speakers. So please feel free to continue to pop your questions in there. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, Duncan McCluskey. Duncan is an expert in flood risk management with extensive experience in government and consultancy. He is currently the Principal Flood Specialist in the Environment, Energy and Science Division of the New South Wales Planning, Industry and Environment, and Chair of the National Flood Risk Advisory Group. Duncan works at a strategic level on a range of flood-related policy, technical and industry education initiatives. He is the lead author of the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook, Managing the Floodplain, and is currently leading the update of the New South Wales Government's Floodplain Development Manual. Thank you very much. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd also like to thank AIDR and the FMA for the opportunity to talk today. And I'll go through things pretty quickly so I get a bit more time for questions. So in closing out the presentations, I'm going to talk about how managing the handbook, Floodplain Handbook 7 and its related guides and tools and the other handbooks in the collection can support understanding and managing a flood risk to achieve the vision that floodplains are strategically managed for the sustainable long-term benefit of the community and the environment, and to improve community resilience to floods. Next slide, please. If I could actually get the same thing happening, it'd be good. A few technical problems at this end, sorry. To achieve this vision, Handbook 7 promotes the consideration and management of flood impacts to improve community resilience to flooding by limiting the health, social and financial costs of occupying the floodplain, increasing the sustainable benefits of using the floodplain, and improving and maintaining flood-dependent ecosystems. To do that, one of the key elements is the flood risk management framework, which is shown on the slide, which has floodplain-specific management processes, which are shown in grey, which support understanding and management of flood risk on a location basis, and it links that to roles at a government level on the for what we could call a floodplain management entity, which is often a local council, or it might be a CMA, shown in pink, or it might be a combination of both, and that can involve flood risk management across multiple catchments, and it can also involve flood risk management across catchments which are shared by multiple entities. Next slide, please. Flood risk management can lead to communities that are more flood resilient, with flood risk better understood, flood risk management measures implemented, and flood information available to inform decisions. Flood risk management outcomes for communities can involve or inform prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery activities, as shown on the slide. Next slide, please. Handbook 7 has a range of guides and tools that support the flood risk management framework. These include guides 7.1 and template 7.4 that assist in specifying flood risk management projects, guide 7.6 that assists in the assessment of management options for treating risk to the existing community, guide 7.2 and 7.3 that assist in understanding some of the constraints that flood places on land, guide 7.5 and practice note 7.7 that discuss how information on a range of flood-related constraints can be considered in land use planning. Next slide, please. AIDR guidance beyond the Handbook 7 series can inform investigations on the flood risk management framework. The Community Engagement Handbook can be used to inform community consultation. Guidance on using the total warning system for flood, which is currently being finalised, can be used when examining the effectiveness of current warnings and the need for new or upgraded flood warning systems. Flood emergency management planning on for disaster resilience can help inform consideration of whether current community flood emergency management planning is adequate or whether it may need review. Land use planning for disaster resilience communities can support consideration of whether current land use planning arrangements are effective in addressing flood risk and whether these should be reviewed. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, technical issues at my end. 15,000 emails coming in. The flood risk management framework can also feed into other related handbooks. For example, it may assist those developing or implementing strategic land use planning by providing information on flood constraints on land to support the development, update, or implementation of strategic land use planning arrangements. The flood risk management framework can make recommendations for improving land use planning arrangements. It can also provide a link to expert flood risk management advice to support collaborative development, update, and implementation of strategic land use planning. And land use planning that effectively considers both flood risk and flood emergency management can limit the growth in flood risk that results from new development and redevelopment in flood affected areas. It can also support building back better after natural disaster in a way that better supports community flood resilience. Next slide, please. The outcomes of the flood risk management framework can also inform those undertaking or updating flood emergency management planning. The flood risk management framework can provide information to support flood emergency management planning. It may make recommendations to improve flood emergency management planning and flood warning or evacuation infrastructure. It can also provide a link to that expertise in flood risk management to support those collaborative efforts. Strong links between flood risk management and emergency management, and of course land use planning can support community flood resilience. Next slide, please. Overall, considering the handbook collection in this way can encourage collaboration between flood risk managers, emergency managers, and land use planners. It can provide the basis for managing flood risk to existing communities and the increase in flood risk and managing the increase in flood risk due to the development as community grows. It can support decisions that consider flood risk, decisions to implement flood risk management actions, better informed and up-to-date flood emergency management planning, better informed and up-to-date land use planning that effectively considers flood risks. This can lead to improvements in community flood resilience and achieving the vision. Going back to vision, floodplains are strategically managed for sustainable long-term benefit of a community and the environment and to improve community resilience to floods. Thanks again for the opportunity and thank you everybody, and I'll hand back over to Amanda.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'd now like to invite all of our presenters to turn on their cameras and their sound. We're going to move straight into the Q&A session. We have about 15 minutes for this session and we'll close the webinar promptly at 3 p.m. So I will now go to your questions. It's not too late. If you have a question, please put it into the Q&A box. But I will start with one of the questions that seems to be a lot of people are interested in this. When preparing to undertake a flood study or model, what should be considered early on in order to enable and support sound and flood emergency management planning? I might go to you, Andrew Gissing, first.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very long list. And I think probably the best way to answer that is, and maybe AIDR can play a role here in distributing this information, but there obviously is some of that in the handbook, but there's various guidelines. I know Victoria's worked on some stuff there with DELP through the CMAs, the same with Duncan and Angela there in DPI in New South Wales. So there's obviously a large, long list, but I think head to the handbook. There's some good guidance there, and you'll find it. But I don't really want to pick on any individual aspect because a lot of them are very important.
Would anyone else like to answer or respond to that question? Consider it early on considerations. Tamsin.
Yeah, I think the only addition that I would suggest is just considering the process as opposed to just, so the detail is very important to confirm, but as long as you've brought the right people around to have the discussion to determine what's required in the planning process, and exactly as Andrew's mentioned, making sure that you have a broad range of stakeholders, that by following a robust process, you're more likely to be able to sort through what those critical elements are. And as Andrew has mentioned, there's a lot of guidance material out there as well.
Thanks, Tamsin. Anyone else feel the need to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I'll have a quick response to that.
Yeah, sure.
We have flood risk management briefs that outline typical requirements for studies as well. So that really provides a starting point on scoping and to get the information that you might need. So these absolutely have to be fit for purpose though. So there is no one size fits all, and you do have to engage with others that are experts in that area to come in and really assist in getting those outcomes. We also, there's also a brief as part of the Managing Floodplain Handbook 7 guidance material as well, and that'll give you a really good place to start on the briefs.
Thanks very much, Angela. Look, I might go to a somewhat political question, and I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that, but it may be you, Mike, given your background with local government, but why do we keep allowing developments in flood-prone areas?
Yeah, I actually read that question a moment ago, and I think somebody put up something on the screen. I saw some little dollar signs come up, which wasn't, I don't think was lost on anybody. Look, development and growth is very much a political issue, and it's very much about expanding our areas. The entire Brisbane area is built on a floodplain. The entire area is, and I know to my New South Wales companions down there, certainly out around the Hawkesbury and places like that, you've got major flooding issues. There are inevitabilities and there are management processes come into play. We've got very strict guidelines up here on the dealings of councillors with developers, but developments do go through. And unfortunately, I can tell you this right now, one of the things that I am finding is, despite bushfires, floods and everything else, not really just being on floods at the present time, we're still seeing from the Royal Commission that's just been conducted, this is a continuing problem. So I'm sorry I haven't got an answer to that, other than to say that the continued process of looking at management is not just about stopping development. It's about mitigating, allowing development, coming up with solutions that will better be able to deal with flood situations when they arise.
Thanks, Mike. Ian, as the president of FMA, would you like to respond to that as well? You must see quite a lot of this issue.
Mandy, yes, I agree with what Mike's closing comments were just then, but also another factor that I have witnessed over the last few decades is there's a very strong group called the Urban Development Institute of Australia, and they are excellent at lobbying respective governments, and the obviously that's their role in life is to see as much development as possible and as fast as possible, and they're very good at it. So what we need to do is get governments to recognise the pitfalls of that and try to, as has been said and as Angela said, trying to work with sensible and wise use of floodplains in the development process.
Thanks, Ian. Look, there was this question relates to better engagement, and certainly when we did the chat bomb, there was a lot in the chat bomb around, you know, how do we engage better with communities, how do we engage better with stakeholders? So I'll pose the question, and perhaps, I don't know, Duncan, you might like to respond to this. Do you have advice on how to gain greater engagement with planning teams and elected representatives? Problems are often acknowledged, but development continues as apparently able to be mitigated.
Yeah.
Like comment?
I guess a couple of things here, and I might go back to the last question a little bit without being political. And I guess planning, land use planning is difficult. It's often a compromise around a range of constraints on the land, whether it be fire or flood or all natural hazards, amongst other things. One of the key things is that hazards like flood, we know where they're going to happen. Sometimes you can't do anything about them in certain areas, so you need to think about where you need to think about where you're developing fairly carefully. That's why I understand the variation constraints around flooding is good. It's not about removing everything from the floodplain, but it might be about keeping out of some areas of floodplain. In terms of engagement, I think you've got to look at the processes. The flood risk management framework, I guess, it would encourage that engagement. In New South Wales, we use what we call flood risk management committees with councils, where it brings together emergency managers, usually council land use planners, council engineers, representatives from my agency, as well as often one of the council laws themselves and a range of other community members to try and help to show there's a what do you call it, a transparent process in developing and understanding flooding. So it can bring, and how you might engage with the community on that. So I think they can help, but I think you've also got to reach out. So if you're in a council and you're doing emergency management, you need to think about who your planning teams, who's in your planning team, what they might need to know, who else you can get advice from, because we do see at times, and I've seen over the years, that you'll see one area of council will know nothing about what the other area of council is doing. And it certainly happens as like government as well.
Thanks, Duncan. And Tamsin, you spoke a lot about making sure local knowledge was captured. So you obviously have a deliberative engagement process that VicSES use with local communities. Would you like to explain how you'd go about that?
Yeah, so when it comes to local knowledge specifically, from a state level, as I've mentioned, that we have the policy that I think actually was developed in Andrew Gissing's time at VicSES. But really we look to try and support our regional personnel, really develop and maintain the relationships locally. So from our perspective, the way that we can contribute to that from a state level is making sure that we're developing the strategies and processes as well as systems that may improve how communication occurs, such as the Snaps and Solve project that I've mentioned, but realistically that those relationships are really built over a long amount of time. There is a huge investment by our regional personnel to develop and maintain those relationships. And I guess picking up on some of the practices from the community engagement handbook, which is really focusing on key community leaders and members that can be engaged with by the organisation. But of course that these are really important relationships that need a lot of time, mutual respect to be cultivated, and also a real recognition. And we've learned through many different instances of flooding across the state, which has had the silver lining of engaging community members. Some community groups have even organically formed post-flood events with quite, some really challenging circumstances around that. So we really rely on our regional personnel to have those close connections across the stakeholders within the sector, industry as well as community, to understand who's best to engage with, and of course us at the state level try and support through those systems and practices.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. I was going to give a plug for the Community Engagement Handbook and you did it for me. And the AIDR team has posted a link to that and another companion tool that can help people online. Andrew, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's about culture too. So, there's plenty of good guidance there, as you say, in the various handbooks about how to do it, but it's about culture. And I suppose it's probably, rather than throw some advice out there, throw a question. In your organisation, what's the culture like in terms of willing to engage with communities, not look inwardly and think about, how we're going to do this as an organisation. Think about how we're going to do this as a collective. So working with communities, working with other agencies, etc. As a key principle of the handbook is that integrated approach. So it's looking beyond your shores and looking about how you're going to work with others, and challenge that culture. Always be looking outside the door and see who else is there to work with, because ultimately in these larger catastrophic floods, you're going to be left with no choice. And if you haven't done that in the planning phase, you're really going to struggle. So now in the planning time is the time to build those relationships. We often talk about emergency management being a game of relationships, which I agree with, but often we ignore some of the the community groups, the community members that can make our lives a lot easier if we do it now.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think Ian wanted to respond to that as well.
I'll just add to it, Amanda. The Achilles heel in New South Wales anyway is poor old elected councillors, and I've been one myself. They might be elected on some other particular issue, and then they're suddenly confronted with land use planning issues and so on. And in this case, I can tell you that the way not to do community engagement is don't ever have a town hall meeting. Strike that out. You need a well-planned and thoughtful community engagement process. Things like if a flood study reveals that development's not appropriate, council has to then deal with the zoning, with the LEP issues, and so on, considering DA approvals, and all that is very difficult for elected representatives. So don't have a town hall meeting. Instead, you need a well-planned community engagement strategy, because otherwise anyone who's affected by or adversely affected is going to put so much pressure on the elected councils.
Amanda, it's Mike Lolback. Can I just add on that last point that Ian made? I think it's very relevant, having worked in community engagement for quite a number of years. The handbook advocates for making sure we've got a collaborative group. You should have community engagement professionals, people who understand the space. Don't take it for granted and don't treat it as a necessary evil. It's an important part of the process. Unfortunately, I think given the question that was asked earlier, what we've seen so many times, people treat it as a box to tick rather than a meaningful process of bringing information out. So please make sure you have got community practitioners who are involved in your planning process so that they can put meaningful consultation and engagement together.
Thanks, Mike. That's a very important consideration. Over to you as well. Just there's been quite a specific question, Mike, for you. So there is now a wealth of data available is there now a wealth of data available to identify triggers when the next catastrophic event hits Brisbane and an early warning system in place?
Yes, no, maybe. is the question. Look, I think the bottom line with it is certainly the work being done at Brisbane City Council since the 2011 floods has been outstanding. They have completely revisited their city central evacuation processes. There's a greater understanding of what the needs are. As you can imagine, when an event like that hits a major capital city, and hasn't happened for a number of years, then there is quite a bit of panic around the place. What's happened is there is a better level of understanding, etc. And it shouldn't be lost on anybody when we talk about emergency warning systems now. The greater increases in the use of social media and those sort of platforms provide great opportunities to let people know early what's going out. So I would say that Brisbane City Council and the greater Brisbane region have done some incredibly outstanding planning in how to deal with events as they come in. I think the crux of what I was saying earlier is there is more to be done around the mitigation of the risk itself rather than waiting for it to hit and then having a strategy in place to deal with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Look, I think we're heading to the last couple of minutes of our webinar, so I'll wrap up the questions now. I will just let everyone know that we have this recording. This will be recorded. It will be posted on the AIDR Knowledge Hub, and everyone who registered will receive an email advising when that's available and so on. And I also encourage you to explore the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection on the Knowledge Hub. On your screens, you will be able to see a word cloud that Melissa within the AIDR team has very cleverly been able to put together from your responses to the chat bomb. And how these word clouds work is when the words that appear in a larger font are things that most people spoke about. So, you know, community is at the heart of our decision making for risk reduction and building resilient communities. We can see risk, we can see flood, we can see collaboration and mitigation. So it's great to see all your words coming forward at the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank all our speakers. Your expertise has been extremely interesting, your contributions to this webinar, and you all took a slightly different approach and aspect of the handbook. So I thank you for your thoughtful and insightful comments. As I said, this handbook will be available now on the Knowledge Hub, and this recording will be available for you in a few days' time, and we will send out a link to that. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Thank you again to our speakers, and good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.